Episode is called Food and Fellowship at Christ's Last Supper. Right, well, it was shortly before the Jewish Passover in Judea, and the man who had been destined to be king of the Jews knew that his excruciating and humiliating death was soon to befall him. Not soon enough for the Jewish religious establishment, who wanted him dead years ago, despite all the good he had done throughout the land. Even the multitudes of common Jews who had been blessed by his marvellous works were fickle enough to turn against him and cry out for a new benefactor. Most troubling was to know his death would not be lamented by his people, to think that he, their king, could be so despised and rejected. But he knew what was in men, the self-interest, the conniving, the treachery, and he sure never put his trust in anyone. Yet even now, at this, the time of his ultimate betrayal and anguish, a small band of followers still stood by him. They were to be heirs of his kingdom if they faithfully obeyed his word. He would not depart this world without leaving final instructions with them on how he should be remembered for all time. With tears in his eyes, for the sake of their fraternal bond and faith toward God, he begged them. Even as he spoke, most of the Jewish religious leaders were huddled together behind locked doors, united by their common hatred of him and hoping to celebrate his death very soon. How jubilant they would be on the day of his final suffering, mocking his weakness and indignity, rejoicing in his pain and anguish, then crowing in triumph once he was dead. But by God, they were in for a shock. They would rue the day of his death. Ha! Judea would be in awe of that day. It would be like nothing the Jews ever imagined. News of that day will spread through the world. It would go down in history. For on that very day, his followers will have all those Jewish leaders massacred. Yes, indeed, priests, rabbis, and elders were right now imprisoned in the stadium, just waiting to be slaughtered by the king's soldiers and archers. Oh, how the Jews will wail and howl that day. Their pathetic cries will rise to high heaven. Despair and sorrow will fill the land. What better tribute to Judea's king than the Jews' grief and wretchedness at his death? What finer legacy than a whole nation in bitter mourning while his grand month-long funeral procession heads to his final resting place at one of the most fabulous fortress palaces in the whole Roman Empire. And after that, however much the Jews loathed and cursed him, they sure as hell would not forget King Herod the Great. Now, you possibly thought at first that the king in this preamble was Jesus Christ, shortly before his crucifixion. But once you heard his order to kill the Jews, you figured this king cannot be Jesus. In fact, you knew it. And not because there is no record of him giving that order, but because in all the New Testament record of Jesus, none of his words or deeds show the arrogance, malice, ruthlessness, or ferocity needed to instigate such a brutal scheme. Those sorts of character traits never manifested in Jesus, and we know this full well by the reliable, harmonious account of his life and ministry. Herod's life history reveals the opposite. We find his character traits on record in Matthew 2, and a few centuries later in a statement attributed to Caesar Augustus by the writer Macrobius. We also find it in what is by far Herod's most comprehensive biography, The Antiquities of the Jews by Flavius Josephus, who drew from first-hand accounts left on record by historian Nicholas of Damascus, himself a friend of Herod, whose brother Ptolemy served as a bookkeeper or accountant in Herod's court. Thus, from these writers has come a pretty detailed, well-rounded portrait of Herod that assures us of a realistic, trustworthy rendering of his complex character. So also for Jesus. It is precisely because he is so well described and depicted in the New Testament that it remains possible, even 2 millennia after his life on earth, to learn of him and come to know him as he truly was. Just in the 4 Gospels alone, which drew from multiple eyewitnesses, we have such an ample record of Jesus' words and deeds set in such a wide cross-section of scenarios and human interactions, we not only can see his acts and behaviour, but can also virtually hear the tone of his voice in many scenes and even perceive his emotions. With the whole New Testament record to affirm and complement the Gospels, our entire account of Jesus presents a full, harmonious portrayal of his demeanour, personality and character. Now, Josephus recorded many grisly murders caused by Herod, a number of them by drowning or strangling or being burned alive. Josephus also reports that Herod executed 9 family members. Meanwhile, Matthew 2 verse 16 describes an enraged Herod ordering the murder of all the male infants around the Bethlehem region in his attempt to kill the Christ child. And a few centuries later, Macrobius cited a quip he attributed to Augustus, saying, "It is better to be Herod's hog than his son," meaning that Herod would sooner butcher his sons than eat pork. And while this attribution has not been independently verified, it is quite plausible, as Caesar Augustus is known to have granted Herod authority to punish his sons as he saw fit, which ended in the violent deaths of 3 of them. So the wider history of Herod shows that malice, ruthlessness and ferocity were major facets of his persona, as was obsession with preserving his power and prestige. Well, everyone's persona is multifaceted, that of both a nameless face in the crowd or the larger-than-life big shot who stamps his mark on world history, whether a man of sin such as Herod or the preeminent man of God, the Lord Jesus. Jesus' own persona during his life and ministry in the flesh was gloriously multifaceted. The things which characterized him in terms of his personality were comprehended in all the fruits of the Spirit in Galatians 5 verses 22 to 23 and in all the attributes of love in 1 Corinthians 13 verses 4 through 8. All traits which he manifested fully and perfectly. Besides these were his actions, of course, and his intellect. We think of his matchless knowledge, understanding and wisdom of the Scriptures, his command of the Scriptures and of parabolic language, and of course his ministries of preaching, teaching, miracles, cures and healings, as well as his many, many deeds of great compassion. As we have seen in this series, a vital characteristic of the Lord was his uninhibited willingness to associate and connect with people around food or drink. That readiness to engage with people by means of table fellowship or commensality without distinctions of social or spiritual standing made him not only radical in his society but also highly visible and widely publicized. One thing indicating food's strong association with Jesus is the fact that nearly 1/10 of the entire Gospels, whether they relate to things that he said or parables or to events in Jesus' ministry, 1/10 of the entire Gospels, depending on how you draw the line, has a connection of some sort with food, meals or dining, which is about the same proportion that food, meals and dining occupy each day of our lives if you add together acquiring, preparing and eating your daily food. Commensality and conviviality were as much as a characteristic of the Lord Jesus Christ as tyranny and bloodshed were characteristic of Herod. So what we're going to talk about this evening is related, of course, to food and fellowship, and it will probably be the most famous account of Jesus around food and fellowship, which of course is the Lord's Supper. It's surely the most widely known meal in the New Testament, in the whole Bible, in fact, indeed in all literature and in all history. And it's when Jesus had with his disciples on the night of his betrayal, and it's known as the Last Supper. There are some 67 verses spread through 4 Gospels and 1 Corinthians 11, which record the 5 accounts of the Last Supper, which we're going to commence this evening. We won't get through all of the verses, of course, and we don't need to. I've actually only taken it up to the point where Judas departs from the meal or from the gathering, but we won't even get that far this evening. The meal to which Jesus gathered his disciples on the night he was betrayed was like very many meals they had shared over more than 3 years. The Last Supper was unique, as I said last time, mainly in that it was the last that they would share together before his death. And this made it specially needful that Jesus draw their attention to back to what he had discussed many times prior, for their sake and for ours, that he was, for example, that he was going to die, but that they must hold on to their faith in him, that they too must bear their own cross and follow his example of self-denial, that they continue to hang on to each other, putting the other first with grace and service, that whenever and as often as they are in company, they keep his memory and words and example alive and keep it their chief focus and the centre of their meetings together. As noted in my talk on food and fellowship with Christ's betrayer, the combined accounts of the Last Supper track harmoniously and chronologically by simply following the verse order presented in all 4 Gospels. I should reiterate, though, that this scheme disagrees with many common scenarios upheld by scholars who insist that the verses can be rearranged. It seems, though, that this insistence arises only from a need to fit the Gospel texts into a variety of staunchly held preconceptions, examples of which include a belief that the Last Supper followed the order of the Jews' Passover Seder at that time, and that Judas Iscariot left the meal before Jesus broke bread or gave the cup. If it cannot be proved with absolute certainty that the 4 Gospels record the Last Supper in chronological order, I think it is still rational to presume so, unless there is irrefutable or at least convincing evidence to the contrary. In the scheme followed here, the Last Supper is presented as 7 more or less distinct scenes. It would be a wonderful thing, I think, to actually depict the Last Supper in a dramatisation, and maybe we could do that one day. So we have 7 scenes here. First, the arrival in the upper room. Second, Jesus' early comments. 3, his giving of a cup to the apostles. 4, the meal in progress when he first mentions a betrayer. 5, the meal in progress as he breaks bread with the disciples. 6, the end of the meal when he gives the cup again. And 7, the subsequent events up until Judas Iscariot's departure. Now, while this scheme does not seem to create any particular complications, if you do find anything at all anachronistic or contradictory or untenable in some way that I must have overlooked or ignored, I will be grateful to hear about it. John's Gospel begins his account of the Last Supper in the midst of proceedings at John 13 verse 2, whereas Matthew, Mark and Luke begin their accounts when the hour for the meal arrived. It was shortly after sundown that evening when Christ came secretly with his 12 apostles to the house and up into the upper room. Around a low table, they sat down on the floor, not in the usual squatted or cross-legged posture, but reclined with their legs and feet pointing outward away from the table like spokes from a wheel hub. With a cushion under him, each man probably lay propped on his left elbow, leaving the right arm free to reach across for food or drink. Over supper, all 13 could see and talk with one another across the table, and John 13 verse 23 shows that each man could lie back against the one next to him. This posture had been customary in Greek homes since antiquity, providing a restful, casual, intimate atmosphere to let diners unwind and relax at the end of the workday, which is believed to be mainly why the Romans later adopted this custom for their own meals. Now, whether the Jews also copied it off the Greeks is a moot point, but a reclined posture at the Last Supper did lend it the same informal, relaxed atmosphere as it was among the Greeks. It helped Christ's final meal before his death to be kept comparatively free of the fastidiousness or punctiliousness, as well as the sanctimony or snobbery, the ritual or ceremony which Judaism tended to impose upon most Jewish table fellowship. I say this in defiance of the many expositors or commentators who teach that Jesus' Last Supper followed the order of service of a rabbinic Passover Seder. I think I would say it even if the supper is ever proved to have been held the same evening as the Jews' Passover, or if the Haggadah or other Talmudic writings are ever proved to correctly describe how the Jews' Passover was held at that time. These things are still in dispute by the historians and archaeologists. Jesus, remember, had often publicly decried both the vain customs or traditions Jews had added to God's word and the Jewish leaders who upheld them. So really it stretches reasoning and credulity as well as the New Testament text to imagine that at a private meal with his closest disciples, Jesus would then indulge in the types of customs and traditions that he decried. Yet this is what many scholars believe and teach. In the second scene of the combined accounts, the first thing recorded about the actual Last Supper meal itself is what Jesus said to the apostles at Luke 22 verses 15 through 16. With desire I have desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I say to you, I will not any more eat thereof until it be fulfilled in the kingdom of God. Now in these words of Jesus, Luke made a few introductory points clear. One is that Jesus would eat this meal here and now before he suffers. Second, this will be his last meal before his death, for that is what he meant by the word suffer, even if the apostles did not yet know it. And three, the meal is inseparably identified or equated with the meal yet to be had in his future kingdom. Now later on in the next scene, Luke will mention a second reference by Jesus to the future kingdom banquet. In fact, Luke wraps his entire record of the Last Supper meal within references to the kingdom banquet. Here in verse 16 at the meal's beginning, and finally in verse 30 at the end of this scenario, when Jesus says to the apostles, "You may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom." This comment brought Jesus' hearers back to his introductory statement, and by recording this comment, Luke brings his readers back to Jesus' introductory comment also, thus bookending the Last Supper with promises of the kingdom, first affirming, then reaffirming Christ's identification of the Last Supper with his meal in that promised kingdom. In speaking this way to his disciples, equating their present meal in the upper room with the future banquet in the kingdom, it might have seemed a tall ask, but Jesus was wanting and requiring them to regard the rather common or garden meal before them in the same way they regard the great and glorious banquet that was so integral to their blessed hope, thus making their present table fellowship an occasion akin to the future gathering that they all eagerly hope to attend alongside all the redeemed and their Redeemer after Jesus returns in his kingdom. This established the meal before them as one which the apostles would, in process of time, come to remember as a foretaste of their blessed hope, the hope of ultimate table fellowship in the kingdom of David yet to be restored. This was the widespread hope of Israel, as shown at Luke 14 verse 15, when one of Jesus' fellow guests in the house of one of the leading Pharisees enthusiastically responded to Jesus, saying, "Blessed is everyone who shall eat bread in the kingdom of God." And I can't prove it, but I imagine that fellow diner was also a Pharisee, being a guest of one of the leading Pharisees. And for each disciple, each of Jesus' apostles, it was from his reminiscence of the Last Supper years later that he would then contemplate and measure every other occasion of table fellowship. For Luke, the kingdom meal is a preeminent theme of the gospel, for it is so integral to the hope of the kingdom. Thus, Luke's emphasis on Jesus' identification of the kingdom meal with the Last Supper meal is essential to his record. It is meant to turn the attention of his readers to other passages in Luke's gospel where table fellowship throughout Jesus' ministry is modelled on the kingdom. Both Matthew and Mark will record a reference by Jesus to the kingdom much later in the account, and together with Luke's 4 references to it, that makes 5 in total during the Last Supper. Incidentally, the reason for saying verse 3 is Luke's final reference to the meal is that his next segment, verses 31 through 34, parallels John 13, verses 36 to 38, which was after Judas Iscariot's departure, which only happened after everyone had supped and received the broken bread and the cup from Jesus. Jesus was never flippant or blasé about food or fellowship, so while he often had more to attend to, aside from eating or drinking, whether it was answering needs or demands or interruptions or contentions which kept him away from table fellowship, those ministries in no way invalidated the propriety or necessity that he attributed to table fellowship at its right time and place. And now, so soon before his death, he felt the serious need of it especially keenly. When Jesus said to the disciples, "I have earnestly desired to eat this Passover with you," he was making distinction, I believe, between this meal that he had arranged in the upper room and the Jews' Passover that Moses first instituted in Egypt. While this does not prove that the supper was on a different evening than the Jews' Passover, whether it was or not makes no difference to the fact that Jesus was drawing the disciples' attention away from the Jews' Passover. By just looking around them, they knew in any case that here was not their customary Passover, for the gathering consisted of Jesus and his followers only. He was not gathered with his natural family, as was a requirement of the Mosaic Passover, for we know that at that time his mothers and brothers did not believe in him. In this third scene, at Luke 22, verses 17 through 18, Jesus took a cup, the Greek word for which is poterion. The InterVarsity Press New Bible Dictionary says it denotes a drinking vessel of any sort. Poterion is so nondescript and obscure, good information about it eludes me. You'd think that you could find most anything on the internet, but I can't find any exacting information about that Greek word. All it does is keep referring me back to Bible references. If anyone can find anything more about it, I'd be very appreciative. I can only conclude it never meant a vessel of a specific size, shape or material, but meant any and all vessels in common use. Typical vessels in Judea at the time were plain clay drinking cups like those used by the Essenes at Qumran, ranging in both width and height from 3 to 7 inches, or about 7 to 17 centimetres. The larger vessels, similar in size to a mixing bowl, held 10 to 15 standard cups, say 3 litres more or less. And so I imagine it is one of those that Jesus took. Here at verse 17, Luke says Jesus took a cup. When Jesus uses it again at verse 20, Luke calls it the cup, and both verses refer to the same vessel. That Jesus took it here at verse 17 means literally in Greek that he received it, in the sense that he accepted a cup that was offered to him. Similarly, a table of wedding guests or restaurant patrons might receive a carafe or wine bottle. The person who gave Jesus the cup was not one of the men seated at table with him, but was surely one of the householders or their staff. So this depicts the supper as including other people there in attendance, and this incidentally would fit with the theory that the house was home to a well-to-do family of Christ's followers or sympathizers whom he had secretly called upon to accommodate the gathering and host the meal. Having received the cup, Jesus gave thanks and said to the apostles, "Take this and divide it among yourselves." Now it is not stated if he set the cup down in their midst or handed it to the person nearest him to pass along. It is clear, though, that he meant them to apportion the wine out to one another, giving each man part responsibility for sharing it out as the cup went around the table, until presumably it came back round to Jesus. Also not made clear is whether each man had to put the poterion to his lips and take a draught that way, or pour the wine out of that cup into his own individual cup. To a people for whom wine was the staple drink, though, and whose total consumption is estimated to have averaged 1 litre per person per day, The usual practice was most probably a separate cup for each person. The Jews, such as priests, Sadducees, and Pharisees, were fastidious and meticulous not to be defiled by other people. So for them, separate cups must have been obligatory or mandatory. And because Mark 7 verse 3 says the practices or traditions handed down by the Jewish elders were adopted by all Jews, then a cup for every diner will probably have been normal practice in most, if not all, Jewish households. Jesus was often travelling, and his close disciples often carried their food with them. For example, at Matthew 15 verse 34 and Mark 8 verse 14. So each man probably had a small drink cup with him at all times and could have used it here at the supper table. As he offered the cup, Jesus told the disciples, "For I say to you, I will not drink any of the fruit of the vine at all until the kingdom of God comes." Now, a plain reading of this remark in our English Bibles implies that Jesus meant he would not drink during this meal. But in my interlinear Greek versions, the wording of verse 18 matches that of verse 16. It reads as though Jesus is saying only the same thing now about the wine that he had said just a little while ago about the whole meal. As well as verse 15, where Jesus stated his desire to eat this Passover, there are other passages indicating that Jesus certainly ate the Last Supper alongside the disciples. Matthew 26 verse 23, Mark 14 verse 18 and verse 20, and John verse 13 verse 18. These are proof his words at verse 16 did not mean he would forego eating. It should surely follow, therefore, that verse 18 also does not mean he would forego drinking. Jesus, I submit, just meant he would desist from drinking the fruit of the vine once the meal was done, and he would state this again, but more directly, after they had supped. It is sometimes thought that the term fruit of the vine inevitably meant unfermented grape juice rather than wine. Obviously, it can mean grape juice in common parlance, but not inevitably. It could refer to either fresh unfermented juice or wine in its full-bodied state. If Jesus used the term fruit of the vine to possibly allow for different tolerances of the fermented product or to dissociate his Last Supper from wine's negative connotations, the term was already used to refer to alcoholic, intoxicating wine anyway in many of the apocryphal writings. So it was a well-known phrase used to describe alcoholic wine. In fact, Jesus' mention of drinking the fruit of the vine in the kingdom is probably sufficient proof that he had in mind the fermented alcoholic product, for Isaiah 25 verse 6 refers to it explicitly. The Lord of hosts will prepare a feast of fat things for all peoples on this mountain, a banquet of wine on its lees, fat pieces with marrow, and wine refined on its lees. Wine on its lees is equivalent to modern wines such as champagne, which are fermented and matured in the same way. The fourth scene is depicted in two Gospels, Matthew and Mark, at Matthew chapter 26 verses 21 through 25 and Mark 14 verses 18 through 21. Here the meal is in progress when Jesus mentions his betrayer for the very first time. Matthew and Mark next relate the response to Jesus' words by the majority of disciples and then by Judas, and they give Jesus' reply in each case. When the dining began, they obviously were all consuming what was on the table. These would have been solids and liquids, and certainly included the twin staples of food and drink, which throughout the Bible are bread and wine, of course. But Matthew and Mark will also have alluded to the condiments eaten with bread, of which there are many in the Bible. The meat and yogurt Abram served with unleavened bread cakes. The lentil stew Jacob gave Esau with bread. the bitter herbs eaten with unleavened bread at the Jews' Passover, roasted grain with vinegar, which Boaz offered Ruth, the fishes eaten with bread at the feedings of the 5,000 and the 4,000. And in John 21, when Jesus is on the lake shore and he calls out to the men on the boat early in the morning who had caught nothing all night, and he says, have you caught anything? The actual word in Greek means, have you caught anything to eat with bread? He was alluding to fish at that time, of course, but the Greek word simply relates to any relish or condiment that was eaten with bread. We considered this scene at some length in an earlier talk to stress Jesus' interaction with his betrayer Judas. The scene that I'm referring to, of course, is Jesus divulging that one of them would betray him. Now, we should now consider that Jesus used the meal as the proper setting in which to drop his bombshell on the disciples, his revelation of a betrayer. To the apostles, the prospect of betrayal itself was not new. They had first been shocked and grieved to hear it from Jesus 6 months earlier at Matthew 17, verses 22 to 23, and again little more than a week ago at Matthew 20, verses 18 through 19. But now the apostles' shock and grief is from hearing that such treachery should come from one of them. Of all 12 apostles, only Judas, of course, knows at this stage who Jesus meant. None of the other 11 know who the betrayer is. All that any of them can know is that the betrayer might be any one of the other 11. Each individual among the 11 then realizes that he has been associating himself with the betrayer at a meal, what for all Jews is the epitome of spiritual fellowship. He realizes, in fact, that during the whole time he has spent innocently dining at the table, the betrayer might be sitting right beside him. They may have been conversing with each other like bosom companions. They could have even passed some of the food or drink to one another. It was outrageous, a sacrilege, enough to put a true disciple of Christ off his meal and spurn this table fellowship until they deal with the traitor. The worst thing is all the other 11 pairs of eyes all looking at him. But all the 11 apostles must also have noticed is that while Jesus knew who his betrayer was, without question, he clearly chose not to treat him the way that they, the betrayer's fellow disciples, would have chosen to treat him if they could. We all know the acrimony with which family, friends and comrades can fall out over grievances or transgressions, and we all know with what fervent zeal some of Jesus' followers disfellowship each other for many and various reasons. Acts of treachery especially are universally despised, and of course Russia is a case in point over the last couple of days. Acts of treachery are never taken calmly by the offended parties, so we can imagine how acrimoniously and fervently Jesus' other disciples would have shown their indignation to his betrayer if they ever found him out. The apostles James and John felt homicidal toward the Samaritans who snubbed them at Luke 9 verse 54, and Simon Peter would wield a sword to protect his Lord from arrest at John 18 verse 10. But Jesus would have none of this kind of animosity, not even against his betrayer, and he never gave the others opportunity to express their outrage against him in any way. Instead, the Lord let all his disciples see that he had chosen to have his betrayer join him. Here at the meal table, Jesus associated, interacted, and eaten and drank with every disciple without showing any noticeable difference in his relations with any of them. Jesus had treated them all alike without either antipathy or favoritism. Neither before nor after he mentioned a betrayer did he manifest any partiality, ostracism, lack of cordiality or coolness that could give any clue of Judas's guilt to the other apostles. Jesus not only used their table fellowship to show forbearance to his betrayer, but vitally, he also ensured the other disciples all knew it. I believe this is one of the main reasons that Jesus mentioned the betrayer at this time and not outside. This was an important thing that he had to do in the midst of table fellowship. For the other disciples, the revelation that they were dining with a backstabber will have been a bitter pill to swallow. But here was their Lord doing so, eating and drinking with an enemy, with no sign on his part of reluctance or resistance. And thus Jesus forced the other apostles to realize that as he himself was fellowshipping a sinful fellow disciple, so they, by remaining with him, were doing the same. That is, by abiding with Jesus, they were in the same fellowship scenario as Jesus. And that if this was not what they would choose to do, it was nonetheless his choice for them. So doing, the Lord showed the other 11 apostles, plus all his followers thereafter, the high bar to which he expects them to aspire in showing forth his example to others, however wrong, despicable, and culpable those others might ultimately be judged to be. Now, the lessons Jesus had given the apostles about table fellowship with his betrayer were things that they needed to chew on as they continued with their meal. That they did, in fact, resume eating is shown by Matthew and Mark's next verses, who use the same words now that they used in the previous scene. But the mood at the supper is more serious and somber since Jesus mentioned a betrayer. Each apostle, Judas included, appears tense and anxious, but also more contemplative and reflective than before. The minds of the 11 must all be churning over with possibilities as to the betrayer's identity and the ramifications of it. There may be the odd individual still desperately searching his own heart as he asks himself, "Is it I?" And Jesus will be watching and appraising them all before he mentions his betrayal again, as recorded in Luke and in John's Gospels at a later stage. Meanwhile, as the supper goes on, Jesus prepares to teach them another lesson around table fellowship. There are loaves unclaimed on the table, and one of these will suffice to illustrate what he had taught his disciples at other times, but which he must impress upon them even more definitively now at this, their final meal before his death. The loaves he can choose from might be those like cakes in the form of bricks or stones, or could be the pan-shaped loaves like naan or pita bread or pizza base. There are other loaves too, varieties that reflect the numerous ways bread is made. It makes no difference. Whichever loaf he uses will be leavened bread. The Greek word for it is atos, meaning dough raised up by fermentation. That is the bread that's referred to throughout the Last Supper. Around the table, the disciples look pensive and distracted from still absorbing the bad news of a betrayer. They exhibit various emotions and behaviours in reaction to it, from sullen and brooding as they pick at the food, to agitated and restless as they busily keep working at their meal. As soon as Jesus reminded them this evening of his appalling belief that he would be betrayed to his Jewish enemies and be killed, sadness had washed over them again. Now their melancholy is mixed with worry, distrust, anger, and paranoia as they each become aware of and sensitive to the other disciples' suspicions and speculations. Now there remains at least one loaf on the table among them when Jesus reaches over to take it, and with this simple action, Matthew 26 verse 26, Mark 14 verse 22, and Luke 22 verse 19, as well as Paul's words at 1 Corinthians 11 verses 23 through 24, now commence their four parallel accounts of this fifth scene. So Jesus took bread, or we might say he took a loaf. Here the Greek word translated took simply means to take hold of. It does not imply Jesus received it from someone else, as in the case of the cup that he took earlier. From here on, through the Last Supper narrative in the King James Version, the words take or took have this basic meaning of taking hold of something. Matthew and Mark both say Jesus did this in front of the disciples as they were eating, or as they did eat. using the identical phrase they used for when Jesus first mentioned a betrayer at Matthew 26 verse 21 and Mark 14 verse 18. It means the meal was still ongoing and that the bread Jesus took was part of the food still being eaten at that time. Like everyone else at the table, Jesus will have taken the loaf from the same basket or tray or cloth they all took their loaves from. This was neither an extraordinary action nor an extraordinary loaf. At every other stage of the meal, it would have gone quite unnoticed and certainly unrecorded. What caught the diners' attention was that Jesus then raised his voice to give God both thanks and blessing for the loaf. The apostles certainly admired the inimitable way Jesus prayed, as Luke 11 verse 1 indicates, so Jesus had an attentive audience. They will have been particularly moved by the fact that although an awful sense of apprehension had come upon them since hearing of the betrayer, the Lord himself remained full of gratitude and full of praise to God. He was exhorting and encouraging himself during the prayer with that joy set before him for which he was soon to endure the cross. But by doing so at this time, he also helped to encourage and exhort the anxious disciples. Amid the hush, once he stopped praying, Jesus then famously broke the bread, gave the pieces to the disciples and said to them, "Take, eat, this is my body which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." It is neither certain if Paul also quoted Jesus as saying, "The bread broken for you is my body," or that "the bread is my body broken for you," nor is it certain if he did say that, whether the word broken refers to the bread or to Jesus' body. It is not something we need to consider at this stage, but perhaps in a later talk. Earlier, at the outset of the meal, Luke 22 verse 17 recorded how Jesus had received a wine cup from someone, then handed it over to the apostles and instructed them to share it between one another. Whereas now, verses 19 through 20 records that he picks up a loaf and gives thanks for it, exactly as he had given for the cup earlier, but then, rather than hand over the whole loaf to the disciples as he had done with the cup, he instead breaks the bread. That is, he tears it into portions and then proceeds to give out the portions himself personally. So Luke shows Jesus had let the apostles themselves share out the wine, but later chose to share out the bread for them. Jesus may have done this by reaching across to each outstretched hand if the table was small and square enough. This seems most unlikely though. Instead, Jesus apparently got up from the table and walked around it, handing a portion of the broken bread to each disciple where he sat in the same way as a restaurant waiter. This is evidently confirmed by what Jesus later says to them at Luke 22 verse 27. Who is greater, the one who reclines or the one who serves? Is it not the one who reclines? Yet I am among you as the one who serves. Well, the service Jesus spoke of was here now in the upper room, and the inference is plain that he had left his reclined position to serve out the bread and wine. His words certainly also related to the foot washing in John 13, a connection which would have been clear at the time, but in the context of Luke's record, which led into verse 30 with Jesus' words about eating and drinking at his table in his kingdom, the object or the subject of Christ's service at verse 27 is not the foot washing, but the meal itself. It is the same way Joseph in Egypt served food and wine to his brethren. This action by the Lord of purposefully, intentionally serving the disciples is not a thing he had done at the supper before now. The cup he gave them at the start of the meal had been for the whole group. It was not for him alone. So upon accepting it from one of the householders or their staff, he had simply passed it to the apostles for them to share out. The breaking of bread is the first time Jesus provided them with anything from the meal which, once he laid hands on it, was then his to eat or drink. In fact, among Arab and other Middle Eastern societies, having put your hand on something, it would be regarded as unclean for somebody else to then take it. Obviously, Jesus didn't have those sort of scruples, but there you go. Offering the disciples what was in effect his bread was something new this evening, and evidently not something that any one of them had done. At Matthew 26 verse 26 and Mark 14 verse 22, as they clearly related it, the loaf was taken, broken, given, and then eaten while the meal was in progress, which is to say, the broken bread was eaten as part of the meal. Back at his table place, Jesus resumed eating with his disciples as he had done hundreds of times over the past 3 years or so. Some eat their portion wrapped around meat, fish, or vegetables. Others scoop theirs into chutneys of minced fruits and yogurt, or into pastes of ground grains and legumes mixed in olive oil. And maybe someone eats some of it without any sort of relish, but he would be unusual in doing so. Each man uses his last handful of the bread to finally sop up sauce or liquid. So we see that by giving them his bread as they were eating, Jesus engaged with the apostles not to distract or separate or deflect them from the meal, but to contribute to it. We know the meal did not suddenly cease once Jesus broke and distributed the bread, because it is not until the next scene that the record says the supper was ended. This stage, still a little later on, is when Jesus will proceed to share out the wine. Now, 1 Corinthians 11 verse 23, Paul begins his account of the breaking of bread by firstly relating it to a momentous event from the same 24-hour period. He says, not that it was back in the day when Jesus died, but that it was on the night he was betrayed. Much like with the previous scene in Matthew and Mark, Paul relates the breaking of bread scene to the betrayal, and thus to the betrayer himself, and so thereby to Jesus' response to his betrayer. Obviously, Paul had a very specific intention when writing these things to the Corinthians at that time. Jesus had already demonstrated by table fellowship this evening his readiness, willingness, and ability to invite, accept, and associate with his betrayer. Now, by giving everyone of his own bread, he has shown he is equally ready, willing, and able to serve and give to his betrayer the same way as he serves and gives to the rest, without even a hint of aversion or discrimination. Paul was reminding his readers to ponder and learn from the fact that Jesus could serve and give for the sake of a disciple whom he knows to be on the verge of a heinous and deplorable lapse of faith and commitment. And this the Lord did among followers who not only knew by then that he judged one of them to be a traitor, but who also saw for themselves that it made no discernible difference to how Jesus interacted with any of them. Obviously, there were differences in Jesus' spirit, but there was nothing outwardly that the other disciples could identify that would discriminate between themselves and the betrayer. Paul reminds his readers of that interaction, for by it the apostles at the supper had been shown by Jesus his model of table fellowship for them, and so for all disciples. It was for their learning. It was theirs to imitate. And this is why Paul tells his readers, as Luke tells his also, that Jesus said to the apostles, "Do this in remembrance of me." Following on from this are 4 accounts about what is seemingly one and the same event, a serving of wine in addition to the one which Jesus began the meal with at Luke 22 verse 17. So it is a second serving of wine, and the last to have been recorded at the Last Supper. The 4 accounts are in Matthew 26 verse 27 through 29, Mark 14 verses 23 through 25, Luke 22 at verse 20 this time, and 1 Corinthians 11 verse 25. And they describe the 6th scene of the occasion of the Lord's Supper, the Last Supper. By merging the 4 passages, the combined account reads like this: After supper, that is, after having supped, he also, Jesus also, in the same manner, took a cup, the cup, and gave thanks, and gave it to them, saying, "Drink of it, all of you." And they all drank of it. And after they drank of it, he said to them, "As often as you drink, do this in remembrance of me. For this is my blood, that of the covenant, that which is shed for many for the remission of sins. This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is shed for you. But I say to you that from now on I will in no way drink of this fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it with you newly in the kingdom of my Father. Truly, I tell you, I will not drink any more of the fruit of the vine at all until that day when I drink it newly in the kingdom of God." For Matthew and Mark, this is the first mention of a cup at the Last Supper. Now, whether they wrote a cup or the cup depends on which manuscripts you consult. Paul says the cup because accounts of the Last Supper were well known to the New Testament churches, and so being an important part of that doctrine, the cup was a familiar object in Christian law. Not saying that they kept it as an artifact or anything, but they knew the story of that particular cup. Luke says the cup because he'd already introduced it as a cup at verse 17, and he shows it was the same cup used each time, which is to say the same vessel, the Praetorian. The obvious implication too is that this cup, from which the disciples first divvied out the wine before eating, has since been refilled for their final draught of the evening as the supper drew to an end. We read again that Jesus took the cup, but as I explained at the last scene, this does not now mean that he received it from someone. Just as when Jesus took bread, so here, regarding the cup this time, the Greek word translated took simply means to take hold of. We might even say Jesus laid claim to it before any of the other disciples could take hold of it and help himself to the contents as he had done earlier. Luke and Paul point out that Jesus gave the wine in like manner to how he gave the bread. This means that for a second time, Jesus left the ease and comfort of his reclined position and walked around the table to serve the disciples individually and in person. This time, of course, serving wine instead of bread. I envisage Jesus actually pouring the wine from the big Praetorian into their own individual cups. But as I mentioned earlier, that's uncertain. Here again, Jesus took on a servant's task as if he were a mere butler or wine waiter or kitchen hand, rather than Christ, the Son of the living God, the Lord of lords and King of kings. Luke's purpose in emphasizing the manner of Jesus' role here at verse 20 is apparently to make an important contrast with how the same cup had been handled earlier at verse 17, when Jesus told the apostles to divide it among themselves. We can certainly presume that as Jesus served the cup, he was, as always, judicious, even-handed, impartial and generous, certainly not unfair or niggardly. If his disciples were so charitable and gracious, then they too would have divided the cup in like manner as Jesus did. But is that likely, I wonder? I suggest not, for these were proud, self-absorbed men, each with a sense of superiority and maybe entitlement over his fellow disciples. Obviously, this is not purely conjecture. Their self-aggrandizement did culminate in a quarrel between them as to who was the greatest. And we know this because, again, Luke made a special point of recording the fact. He knew that this had been building up. Frictions and tensions between the disciples are widely recorded in the Gospels, and they show that the verbal altercation in the upper room was a crisis that had been brewing since long before the meal began. It is possible, as many commentators confidently believe, that ever since they arrived and sat down in the upper room this evening, some disciples had been quietly chafing over their seating arrangements. For the Jews did observe a sort of hierarchy at a meal table, which indicated or implied each diner's status or standing in relation to one another. So there may have been disciples that were very disappointed and annoyed at their particular seating position. This is not impossible in the case of the Last Supper, even though Jesus had clearly spoken against traditions of hierarchical and preferential positions during table fellowship. At Luke 14 verse 7, for example, and at Matthew 23 verse 6. But Jesus surely knew his apostles well enough to realize that even in such a simple task as divvying up wine among themselves, their egos will have manifested somehow. So now, as Jesus serves the wine to these men in like manner to how he served the bread, with the humility and meekness of a true servant, the disciples saw a noticeable contrast with themselves and maybe realized their own shortcomings with a sudden pang of evil conscience, which must have stung in much the same way Peter felt so bad and unworthy when Jesus set about to wash his feet. Luke and Paul say this was done after the supper or after having supped. These verses, plus 3 in John, which also refer to this meal by the word supper, are why the meal came to be known as Christ's Last Supper. Luke's and Paul's remarks might just mean Jesus gave the wine to his disciples after they had eaten the broken bread he gave them while the wider meal was still in progress. But in the New Testament and classical Greek, the words translated supped or supper here refer to a meal. So Luke and Paul surely meant that Jesus served the wine after the whole supper had ended. But regardless whether the word supped refers either directly to the bread Jesus distributed or generally to the meal as a whole, it actually amounts to effectively the same thing, namely that the bread and the meal were supped or dined upon without distinction, meaning the bread and the wider meal are inextricably connected and related to each other, just as they always were at a normal meal in biblical times. In fact, both explanations apply because in those days diners would normally finish any meal by using their remaining bread to wipe or sop up leftover soft, semi-liquid or liquid foods such as juice, vinegar, oil, sauce, honey, paste, yogurt, butter or chutney. To do it today is not at all that unusual, of course, but in New Testament times it was the standard practice at most every meal. But we do not need to think that at the Last Supper the disciples of Jesus made clean riddance of everything in front of them. The table etiquette still customary in many ancient societies probably dictated that they leave something behind uneaten, as Jesus seems to have done. Later, after Jesus washed the disciples' feet, there was still a leftover morsel on the table, which he gave to Judas at John 13, verse 26, in part fulfillment of verse 18, where Jesus said that his betrayer is eating his bread. And even at that late stage, after so long a time, as covered by Luke 22, verses 21 through 30, and John 13, verses 1 to 25, which is certainly, I would say, over half an hour after supper is said to have ended, there was still a vessel with some kind of drink or condiment into which Jesus dipped the morsel that he handed to Judas. Thus it was that Jesus gave it to them. That is, in like manner as he gave the bread to the disciples by leaving his reclined position and taking upon himself the form of a servant, so Jesus also shared out the wine. And if it escapes you or I how remarkable this was to the apostles, recall that when Jesus washed their feet, he was doing something normally left to the lowest of household slaves. Not quite so lowly, but still a servile role in a large or wealthy household, such as this is, where the Last Supper is being held, was the role of the staff who would normally wait on the table while the Lord of the house with his family and friends ate and drank to the full. Jesus had taught this principle of meek and humble servitude many times by word and deed, especially at Luke 17, verses 7 through 10, when he asked his apostles back then, "What master has his slave come in from the day's work and tells him to recline and eat?" None. The lowly slave has to wait until he has first dutifully served the master his dinner, not expecting any thanks, and only after that can he, the slave, then eat and drink. I'm paraphrasing that portion, you understand. But Jesus ended that lesson by telling the apostles, "So you too, when you do all the things which are commanded you, say, 'We're unworthy slaves. We've only done what we ought to have done.'" Well, now, at the Last Supper, the apostles must at least be a little embarrassed that their Lord and Messiah has twice now done for them what their collective consciences are telling them they ought to have done for him. These men probably entered the supper feeling that such service was women's work and beneath their dignity. And if, as I believe, there were attendants there, then the disciples would not have given a thought to helping out. But they still had to learn the basics of humility and meekness in being a follower of Christ. By Jesus serving at table in the upper room, as well as washing their feet, he showed them what these lowly aspects of his character look like at their most elementary level. Jesus gave the same lesson twice over, first in the bread, then in the wine, and doubly so for Judas, because the morsel he received before departing, the morsel Judas received before departing, was most probably Jesus' own last piece of bread, soaked in wine from the bottom of the cup, the wine Jesus had denied to himself but gave to everyone else. I will stop at that point. Certainly there's a lot more to discuss, but the main subject that I wish to lead into is the subject of remembrance. As Jesus said, as recorded by Luke and by Paul, in both cases, Jesus said, "Do this in remembrance of me."